Chapter 9. Adler, Batumi, Reflections on the Beach. Buteyko flew into Adler in the afternoon. The humid city smelt of grilling kebabs, and the asphalt was soft in the heat. He made an immediate beeline for the main hotel, but no one had seen the academician Parin. The doctor was downcast. He recalled the voice of Parin's daughter saying, "He's on a road trip around the Caucasus." He could be in Baku or anywhere. A search party would be hard-pressed to find him, and Buteyko only had 7 days left until his defence. Buteyko gulped down a mutton pie, a regional speciality, and swallowed a few sips of Georgian wine, then despairingly threw the paper cup in a bin. He couldn't believe that his defence might not take place. Such an opportunity might not come again. He walked swiftly to the telegraph office and sent dozens of telegrams to hotels in cities across the south. Tbilisi, Sochi, Yerevan. "I urgently need to speak to Academician Parin. Please send his contact details. Return address, main post office, Adler. Dr Buteyko, post restante. Reply paid." Several long days passed. Schoolchildren ran around the shops with their parents, preparing for the start of school. Holidaymakers burned themselves black on the beach. Buteyko waited. He had received only 3 replies, all negative. He kept returning to the map of the Caucasus. For some reason, he felt an overwhelming urge to go to Batumi. The doctor's patience finally ran out, and he went back to the airport. It was the same story as in Novosibirsk. No tickets. There were no direct flights to Batumi, and, most importantly, Buteyko didn't have any influential acquaintances here. He threw himself on the pilot's mercy. "Please help me out. My PhD is at stake." If anyone else had made such a request, they'd probably have been refused. It was high season, and even people with telegrams informing them of funerals couldn't get tickets. But there were few who could resist the doctor, with his direct and open gaze that inspired trust and the particular intonation of his voice. "It's urgent, you say?" A tall, thin pilot stepped away from his colleagues and looked at the doctor. "You can travel as one of us, on a mail flight. I'm flying to Sukhumi today, from where you can get a direct flight to Batumi. The only thing is," he glanced at his watch, "I'm not leaving until later, so we won't get there in time." "Listen." The doctor took the pilot by the arm. "I'm begging you, as one human to another, think of something." The pilot took off his cap and ran his fingers through his hair. I could leave a bit earlier," he said, fiddling with the insignia on the faded cap. But even though they left earlier, they still didn't make it on time. "We're going to be about half an hour late," said the pilot regretfully, trying to squeeze more power out of the tiny engine. "Give it gas," urged Buteyko, oblivious to the turbulence. "If I try to get this bucket of bolts to go any faster, we'll end up kicking the bucket ourselves," replied the pilot, unable to meet Buteyko's impassioned gaze. "Well, radio to Sukhumi. Ask them to wait for an urgent passenger," yelled Buteyko above the engine. At Sukhumi, Buteyko went straight from one aeroplane to the other. The doctor was hurrying, as if Academician Parin was just leaving Batumi, but in fact he had no grounds to suppose that the Academician had even been there or intended going there. By evening he had already visited the local academy, the city hospital, and several hotels, but there was no sign of Parin. Buteyko spent the night on a park bench, as he didn't want to be cooped up in a stuffy hotel room and eaten by bedbugs. He started going around hotels again at dawn. "You're looking for Academician Parin?" asked the receptionist in the in-tourist hotel. "Yes, he was here. He left 5 days ago." "He can't have." Buteyko leant against the desk and wiped his eyes, which were red after his night outdoors. "I checked him out myself." The receptionist began to leaf through the ledger. "Academician Parin and his wife," said Buteyko, trying to make absolutely certain. "He's not very tall, very short hair. "That's right," said the receptionist. "His wife is a big woman with brown hair." The doctor's heart sank. Everything was lost. "Yes, here it is." The receptionist, pleased with himself, passed Buteyko the ledger. "Academician Oparin. Oh, do you understand?" cried the doctor, seizing the receptionist by the collar. My dear man," said the receptionist, freeing himself from Buteyko. "Parin, Oparin, what's the difference? He was an academician." "Maybe there's no difference to you," Buteyko exclaimed excitedly, "but it makes a big difference to me. If Oparin has left, that means that Parin could still arrive." "Arrive where?" The receptionist stared at him, wide-eyed. "I'll reserve a luxury double room for the academician and his wife for 4 nights," Buteyko told the astounded man. "Fill in the form, and so on." The doctor paid the bill, adding a tip. He described the academician in detail and told the receptionist where he could be found. He then set off for the port. When Buteyko found out from the ticket cashier that a steamboat was leaving Batumi for Odessa on the 1st of September, he booked the academician and his wife a luxury double cabin. With the same certainty as at the hotel, he again described Parin and asked the port administrators to tell him if the academician arrived. "I'll be here," said Buteyko, finishing his instructions, "on the restaurant veranda or lying on the beach." He had automatically felt that he should book the academician a ticket on the steamboat as soon as the cashier had mentioned it. This intuition undoubtedly came from telepathy, in which Buteyko believed, but which Parin categorically denied. This same sixth sense told Buteyko that he should wait for Parin right there. The doctor spent the day zigzagging between the restaurant veranda and the small beach. He managed to slightly calm his frayed nerves by sipping the local wine. When he lay on a recliner to sun himself a little, his head began to spin pleasantly. It was the 29th of August, the 6th day of his journey, with only 3 remaining until his defence. He closed his eyes and lay back on the salt-weathered boards of the wooden recliner. August was almost over. He didn't yet know what this autumn would bring. But it was at this time 2 years ago that he became completely estranged from Professor Pomeykin. On the 11th of November 2 years ago, Buteyko had presented his discovery to the Scientific Council of the Siberian branch of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Unlike some other such presentations, it was based on more than the overexcitement of the pioneering scientist. Buteyko had 7 years of hard work behind him, starting from October 1952, which he had spent gathering proof. He had cured hundreds of patients from asthma, hypertension, and angina, and he had created his combine complexator, which could give a mathematically accurate picture of a patient's health. Buteyko completed his work on the complexator in Novosibirsk, but he had gathered much of his data in Moscow at the beginning of the 1950s, in his laboratory in academician Daryev's department. It was at this time that he developed the most important components of the complexator. Buteyko propped himself up on his elbows and looked in the direction of the restaurant veranda. No one was looking for him yet. He rested his head in the crook of his right arm and mentally returned to November 1960. How curiously his colleagues had looked at the tables that he had hung on the board. They paid especial attention to one where the 7th row down was marked Death. No one wants to die. Physiological condition of the body and pulmonary ventilation criteria, according to Dr. K. Buteyko. Professor Pomeykin read the heading aloud in a monotone before returning to the chairman's seat. This table allows us to monitor the 7 stages in a patient's progression towards death, or to the longest possible healthy longevity, in other words. Here Buteyko gave an embarrassed smile. By our current modest standards, to virtual immortality. Someone in the audience started sniggering, and there was muttering at the back. Sheikman, former head of the physiological laboratory, was sitting there. I see that some of you don't believe me when I say that carbon dioxide deficiency is the fundamental cause of many common diseases. Buteyko was trying to disregard Sheikman's rudeness, which was, moreover, obviously supported by the chairman. "Let's take a look at the role of carbon dioxide from a historical, biological point of view." Buteyko could feel himself becoming tense, and his piercing gaze made Sheikman fall silent. "What was the Earth's atmosphere composed of several billion years ago?" Buteyko indicated a diagram on the board that showed two lines at first running almost in parallel, one above the other, but which then changed places. "It was mainly composed of carbon dioxide and partially oxidized compounds. Oxygen was practically absent." "This isn't primary school," muttered Sheikman, seemingly to himself. Professor Pomyekin tapped his water carafe with mock strictness. "It can be seen that life evolved in an oxygen-free atmosphere." Buteyko indicated the upper purple line, which showed the percentage of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere long ago. "It was bonded, that's to say inert." The doctor loosened the tie of the Ukrainian's smock shirt visible under his coat. "Everything was made up of carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and so on, which are partially oxidized compounds." He drew his pointer sharply down. "Then, when plants and animals appeared, they began to absorb more carbon dioxide than was emitted from volcanoes, geysers, and the like." The audience began to listen more attentively. He told them how huge quantities of carbon dioxide had been absorbed by plants and trapped underground, forming peat, shale, coal, and soil. "But you can read this in school textbooks," interjected the radiologist, Elvira Samuilovna, who was sitting 2 rows behind Sheikman. "That's right," said Sheikman, turning towards her. They had both apparently forgotten that they were not members of the Scientific Council, and so their attendance was highly improper. "You can indeed read this in textbooks," said Buteyko, dismissing their objections as if brushing away a fly. "So I beg you to remember that the atmosphere was once 70% composed of carbon dioxide, and at earlier periods 90%, instead of 0.03% as it is today." Buteyko focused his attention on the group of young doctors on the left-hand side of the hall who were listening to him intently. "If this tiny proportion of carbon dioxide disappears, life on Earth will be finished. Plants will not be able to photosynthesize, and so humans will have nothing to eat. So that's a more historical perspective on the importance of carbon dioxide than today's usually negative view." He threw this at his audience like a bucket of cold water. Pomyekin grimaced. He knew what Buteyko was getting at. Someone came out onto the restaurant veranda, and Buteyko jumped off his recliner and hurried to get dressed and return to his table. It was a false alarm, however, and in 10 minutes he was once again lying on the warm boards. This introductory speech to the Scientific Council was only the overture. The full concert began a little later, when he began to analyze the table where the last row was marked death. "The Earth's atmosphere has changed a great deal, but animal and human cells still need 6.5% carbon dioxide and only 2% oxygen. The blue horizontal line on this graph shows normal alveolar CO2 in a healthy person who has the necessary 6.5% carbon dioxide. But be careful." His pointer indicated the last row. "Only people who can hold their breath for 1 minute with no effort after normal exhalation have this level of carbon dioxide. To put it in other words, their control pause is 60 seconds. But do many of you have such a long control pause?" The doctors on the left-hand side began to hold their noses, but none of them could even hold their breath after exhaling for even 20 seconds. "I can manage 25, spluttered a red-faced Sheikman. "Your control pause is not 25, but maybe 10 seconds, the doctor rebuked him. "Look how you're gulping air now. 25 is probably your maximum pause, or even beyond your maximum." He tapped his pointer on the middle column. "Your control pause is the time you can easily hold your breath for after exhaling. You shouldn't need to breathe more deeply after it than before. So, can everyone see how simple this test is?" Buteyko scanned the half-full hall. Even the youngest medical student couldn't manage a control pause of 15 seconds, and for the rest of you, it was probably around 7 to 9 seconds. And Associate Professor Nikiforov could only manage 4 seconds, he said, noting the Associate Professor's raised arm. I don't want to frighten you, Associate Professor, but that's in the 6th and penultimate step of the ladder towards death. Buteyko indicated the second bottom row. Less than 3.5% carbon dioxide in the body means death. The pointer moved down to the last row. Who has proved that? Exclaimed Nikiforov in agitation. His puffy face had a permanently unhealthy cast. A buzz broke out in the hall as everyone began to talk at once. You could be a little more careful when drawing such conclusions, said Pomekin, in a seemingly conciliatory fashion, but with an unambiguous warning in his voice. He was enjoying the commotion. The table of pulmonary ventilation criteria is based on data from the complexator, Buteyko stated firmly. His pale blue eyes glinted icily, in the way that the professor knew so well. Of course, there's been some interpolation and rounding, but the table is reasonably accurate. And it shows, he raised his voice, that practically no one here is healthy with normal breathing. Of course, that's to be expected. We've been told for years on the radio and television and in PE lessons to breathe deeply. But deep breathing removes the last traces of CO2 from the body. So how can you have the required 6.5% carbon dioxide? Most of you here will only have 4 or 5% maximum. Associate Professor Nikiforov brightened up. He wasn't the only one at risk. 4%, 6%, this is all quite abstract to us non-specialists, said the Scientific Council Secretary. The 7th row of that table is marked death, but the row above it's 3.5% CO2, which is, according to you, like being at death's door. But people live for a long time with this level of carbon dioxide. Why should we all make an effort to reach a control pause of 60 seconds? And as for intervening in the functioning of the respiratory centre, it's like trying to control your body temperature or blood pressure. The secretary caught Pomekin's approving gaze and sat down again. Buteyko leant on his pointer and started rocking from his heels to the balls of his feet. Of course, there are people alive with a control pause of 5 seconds, which corresponds to carbon dioxide content of 3.5% in the body, or more exactly, in the alveoli. He stopped rocking. But they don't live very long, and most importantly, they're usually in poor health. He indicated the second bottom row of the table. Something's always wrong with them. And believe me, a sick person will blame anything for their illness, but they never suspect that the fundamental cause is deep breathing. The Scientific Council Secretary industriously noted something in the minutes. Ask any hypertensive patient why he's ill. Buteyko removed his glasses and put them in his pocket. He'll tell you that his heart is weak, or that he's working too hard. He turned to the members of the Scientific Council, who were exchanging glances. However, the mechanism is quite simple. What causes hypertension? Changes in the blood vessels. They become narrower, and the pressure in them correspondingly rises. But what makes the blood vessels constrict? His eyes were alight with a blue flame. Nature didn't expect such a sharp change in the Earth's atmosphere. The same pathways are used to intake air and expel waste gases. When mammals first appeared on Earth, this wasn't a problem. They breathed in mostly carbon dioxide and breathed out whatever their body didn't use. However, now every deep breath contains 21% oxygen and only 0.03% carbon dioxide, but our cells need 6.5 to 7% carbon dioxide. A deep breath in is followed by a deep breath out. This exhalation removes excess unused oxygen. Buteyko slapped his thigh. But it also washes out the CO2, which our bodies need so badly. The Scientific Council Secretary stopped writing and pointedly laid the thin cardboard file aside. The body begins to try to stop carbon dioxide leaving the body. It constricts the smooth muscle of the vessels and airways. When the airways spasm, it causes an asthma attack. When the blood vessels spasm, it causes hypertension. When we breathe deeply, we enter a vicious circle. The deeper we breathe, the more intensively the lungs are ventilated, so more carbon dioxide is eliminated from the body. As a result, the blood vessels spasm, we feel as if we can't get enough air, and so we breathe still more deeply. In addition, there is the Bohr effect. Dr. Buteyko paused for a moment. When we don't have enough CO2 in our bodies, oxygen binds more tightly to hemoglobin in the blood, and as a result, less oxygen is released into the tissues, causing oxygen starvation. Buteyko said a good deal more to the scientific council. He explained, for example, that intestinal colic, and therefore ulcers and gastritis, were caused by spasms of the smooth muscle of the blood vessels and of the intestines themselves, brought on by deep breathing. "Let us suppose that there's some truth in your theories," interrupted Pomyekin, frowning deeply. "What is the solution? Our colleague here was right," he indicated the Scientific Council Secretary. "We can't consciously regulate, for example, our body temperature. What do you propose we do about our breathing?" "We can't regulate our temperature, but we can control our breath with training." The doctor gripped his pointer more tightly. "I've developed a method for this, the volitional elimination of deep breathing, VEDB. He described how many patients had mastered his method and from what illnesses they had been suffering. He presented diagrams showing the results achieved. In the end, Pomyekin was forced to announce that Buteyko's presentation had been highly interesting and that his research must continue. However, the professor soon regretted this commitment. The professor and his cronies quickly realized that if the VEDB and the diseases of deep breathing were officially recognized, they would face a grim choice. Either they could stop cutting up asthma and heart patients left, right, and centre and adopt Buteyko's method, or they would find themselves in the dock, especially if their patients died. The law on medical malpractice was quite clear. If a patient's death following a medical intervention could have been prevented by using another therapy recognized at the time, the doctor would be held criminally responsible. As Pomyekin and his colleagues had no intention of giving up surgery nor swapping their comfortable lifestyles for a prison cell, there was only one option: to isolate the method and its inventor. They set to work immediately.